Evangelical support for Trump was no aberration, nor was it merely a pragmatic choice. It was rather the culmination of evangelicals' embrace of militant masculinity, an ideology that enshrines patriarchal authority and condones the callous display of power at home and abroad. By the time Trump arrived proclaiming himself their savior, conservative white evangelicals had already traded a faith that privileges humility and elevates the least of these for one that derides gentleness as the province of wusses. Rather than turning the other cheek, they'd resolved to defend their faith and their nation, secure in the knowledge that the ends justify the means. Having replaced the Jesus of the Gospels with a vengeful warrior Christ, it's no wonder many came to think of Trump in the same way. In 2016, many observers were stunned at evangelicals' apparent betrayal of their own values. In reality, evangelicals did not cast their vote despite their beliefs, but because of them. That provocative passage comes from a new book by Kristin Du Mez, entitled Jesus and John Wayne: How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation, published last year by Liveright Publishing, a division of North and Co. Hello, my name is James Ungureanu, and I am the host of Confronting History, a George L. Mosse Program and history webinar. George L. Mosse was a great historian, teacher, and mentor, and friend. He taught at the University of Wisconsin-Madison campus for about 40 years, and at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem for 20 years. The mission of the Mosse Program, which he endowed, is to support and sustain international scholarship and provide opportunities for new generations of scholars to experience that community through graduate work, postdoctoral work, faculty exchange, graduate fellowships, scholarly publications, conferences, online courses, a digital archive project, museum exhibits, and much more. This webinar series, Confronting History, which borrows its title from Mosse's own memoir, is designed to maintain engagement and momentum in the network given the limited current opportunities for face-to-face activities. In this series, we will talk to scholars from a range of disciplines, discussing all things at the intersections of European and American history, culture, sexuality, and ideas. And our guest today is none other than Dr. Du Mez, author of Jesus and John Wayne. Welcome to the program, Du Mez.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here with you today.
So how are you?
I'm doing okay. Yeah. Weathering a blizzard and just making it through the pandemic season, which continues to stretch on.
Yeah. So let's just jump right in and start by telling us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Sure. I have a PhD from the University of Notre Dame in American religious history, and I I teach at Calvin University, so a Christian liberal arts university in Grand Rapids, Michigan. My first book is on the history of Christian feminism, particularly evangelical feminism and anti-trafficking activism. It's called A New Gospel for Women. And Jesus and John Wayne is my second book.
Fantastic. Now, what do you teach and research at Calvin University?
I teach American history, so recent U.S. history. I teach women and gender in U.S. history and social and cultural history. And I also teach our West in the World survey course.
Right. Now, a lot of our listeners are likely graduate students or even undergraduates. So this is an important question for them. Who is one of your academic heroes, and why do you admire them so much?
Oh, this is so hard to narrow it down to one. But I think of the moment, I would say I really admire Heather Cox Richardson for the work that she is doing through her public scholarship by really taking her vast training in historical scholarship and and then bringing that into the moment, by which I mean into every single moment of every day. I'm a fan of her newsletter, her regular updates, and being somebody who works at the intersection of kind of academic scholarship and public scholarship, I know what a burden that is to produce that kind of content on such a regular basis. And so I'm incredibly grateful to her for the work that she's doing and daily impressed with that work.
Fantastic. So besides her book, what other books were formative for you when you were a student, and why were they so important and shaping?
The first book that really shook up my academic trajectory was when I got to graduate school, my first semester. I read Kathleen Brown's Good Wives, Nasty Wenches, Anxious Patriarchs. And I had gone to graduate school to study U.S. religious and intellectual history. I had been trained in, I'd gone to a small liberal arts college myself, a Christian college. I came from a very conservative place, and I really thought I had no interest in women's history, no interest in gender history. I wanted to do the history that really mattered, which to me was religious and intellectual history. I thought debates about gender were pretty much limited to, as they were in my little corner of the world, could women serve as pastors, elders, and deacons in the church? And where I was coming from, the answer was a very clear no. So it was a pretty boring debate as far as I was concerned. And then I got to graduate school, and this was in our introductory seminar, and I got to read this book, and it opened my eyes to gender in history, to how masculinity and femininity are linked to power and to change over time. And it was about so much more than ecclesiastical office. So that book absolutely, like that week, I changed my course of study to study of religion and gender. But that's just one book. The professor who introduced that book to me and became one of my advisors was Gail Biederman. And her book, Manliness and Civilization, was just absolutely fundamental to my academic training. Her mentorship has been, and if you read Jesus and John Wayne, and if you've read Manliness and Civilization, it's very obvious. And then I would say a third influence has been the work of Cynthia Enloe, and really any of her work to open my eyes to ways in which gender and militarism are linked. And kind of once you have the eyes to see it, it makes perfect sense, and you see these patterns everywhere. So I'd say those three works have been really influential in the trajectory that my work has taken.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, so you have this new book, Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. Before we discuss some of its details, can you tell us one big idea in your scholarship? What exactly inspired the book?
Really, the book was inspired more than 15 years ago. And when I was teaching a class at Calvin, a class in U.S. history, and I was inspired by Gail Biederman's work on Teddy Roosevelt in particular. And in that lecture, I wanted to bring to students what I had experienced, this kind of aha moment that gender is about so much more than what we think it's about. It's not just a personal thing. It has these broad, sweeping implications. And so I did this great little lecture, I thought, on Teddy Roosevelt and how masculinity was connected to race and power and religion and all sorts of things. And after that class, a couple of students from the class came up to me, a couple of male students, and said, Professor Du Mez, there's this book you really need to read. And that book was John Eldridge's Wild at Heart, which makes a prominent appearance in Jesus and John Wayne. It's a book of Christian masculinity, published in 2001, went on to sell more than 4 million copies, that presents this very militant conception of what it is to be a Christian man. Now, that was back in 2005, 2006, when we had this conversation, when I came across this book, and that was the beginning of the Iraq War. And we are seeing survey data come out in terms of white evangelical support for the Iraq War, for preemptive war in general, far and above the rest of the population, condoning the use of torture, embracing aggressive foreign policy. And so I really just asked the question, what might this literature on Christian masculinity, on evangelical gender roles, what might that have to do with broader issues of foreign policy and the American nation? And that's really the question that put me on the path to write this book.
Okay, the book Wild at Heart is really interesting because the author doesn't rely on the Bible so much. She relies on pop culture, pop icons.
Yes.
And what was it about a kind of popular culture that attracted, I guess, your students to the book?
Yeah, that was the interesting thing when I listened to my students and I read Wild at Heart, and I saw immediately what they were talking about. Right up front, John Eldridge cites or quotes Teddy Roosevelt, and that was the obvious connection. But then I was surprised to go on because evangelicals self-identify as Bible-believing Christians. That's really at the core of their identity. And I was surprised then to find that this book on Christian masculinity actually didn't have all that many Bible verses in it. And those that were there were really just like picked out of context. And instead, Eldridge was looking to mythical heroes, to Hollywood heroes, to Mel Gibson's William Wallace from the movie Braveheart, huge favorite, to cowboys and soldiers, and that struck me as very interesting, and that I think leads us to the title of my book, Jesus and John Wayne. John Wayne, in the conversations around Christian manhood, John Wayne just kept popping up in the literature as the icon of American masculinity and of Christian masculinity. And what I came to see was that for evangelicals who were embracing a particularly militant, militaristic conception of masculinity, the Bible wasn't the greatest resource. Sure, you have the book of Revelation. You've got some gory battles. You've got Jesus turning over, the tables in the temple. But otherwise, you have a lot of things like the fruit of the Spirit, the Beatitudes, the love your neighbors, love your enemies. But instead, I saw evangelicals going outside of this kind of scriptural and Christian formation to Hollywood, to soldiers and warriors, and using this kind of secular model of militant masculinity, and then cloaking that with this kind of Christian identity, which ultimately, I argue in the book, ends up not just changing conceptions of masculinity, but ultimately changing the faith itself.
So the idea for the book occurred about a decade ago. When did you actually start writing the book?
Yeah, I researched it for about a year and a half, and then other things happened. I had to finish my first book. I thought I could write 2 books at once, and then I had a child and another child, and then I had a third child, and so I realized the whole 2 books at once wasn't going to happen. So I just kept meaning to come back to it. But I picked up another project instead, and it was actually in the fall of 2016. In the weeks after the days after the release of the Access Hollywood tape. At the time, I was writing a book, researching a book on Hillary Clinton's faith formation. So I was watching the election very closely from that vantage point, and I was watching white evangelicals with particular interest. But I never completely, set aside the original project on evangelical masculinity and militarism. So I had paid attention over the ensuing decade to where many of these proponents of this militant Christianity ended up, and many of them became embroiled in scandal, in abuse of power or sexual abuse scandals, either directly or indirectly, defending those who were directly implicated. And so with the release of the Access Hollywood tape and with the media kind of centering in on this question of what will white evangelicals do now? Surely they cannot support him through this, these family values evangelicals. And of course they did. A couple wavered ever so briefly. And then they're back, fully supporting. And we had the infamous 81% according to exit polls just a few weeks later. And that's really when it clicked to me, for me. I thought, we've seen this before. We've seen this time and again in evangelical communities and evangelical institutions, embracing a leader, a strong man who promises to protect them, to protect Christianity, to protect the witness of the church through thick and thin. And that's when I knew I needed to set aside the Clinton Project for a time for a variety of reasons. And I just wrote up, pulled up this old research, dusted it off, and wrote a piece in the online journal Religion and Politics on white evangelical masculinity and militarism that presented this thesis. And that went viral. And so I decided, yes, there is something here. And it really resonated, not just with political observers, but most strikingly to me, it resonated with the evangelicals themselves. And so I thought, yes, I need to pursue this. I need to pick this project back up, and I need to have it out before the 2020 election.
Yeah, it's a very timely book. And so the question for me is, what kind of book is it? What was your target audience for the book?
Yeah, it's a book that is a crossover book in many ways, and sometimes they'll succeed and sometimes they don't. I know there's always a risk there. There were always two audiences for this book. So if you would ask my publisher, Liveright, the target audience for this book was essentially anybody who reads the New York Times, right? Anybody who's interested in religion and politics. And so the book is framed for that audience. It, my editor is not at all from the inside of evangelicalism at all. And so I really needed to make sure that I could translate some of these concepts, these themes, so that somebody from outside of this world could still comprehend, scrub it of all this insider language and so on. But for me, my strong secondary audience always was evangelicals themselves. And I think even the subtitle suggests as much, that how white evangelicals corrupted a faith and fractured a nation. The fractured a nation, that's a historical claim. The corrupted a faith, that's not a historical claim. That's actually a theological claim. So there I'm speaking to evangelicals themselves, to Bible-believing evangelicals, and saying, okay, you claim this, I'm going to show you this. And I want to speak directly to evangelicals. That said, many books that are written by evangelicals for evangelicals strike a more ironic tone than this one does. This has been described as urgent and sharp-elbowed, and I think that's an apt description. And that was actually quite important to me. The tone of the book, because having studied this evangelical world for so long, and having seen these patterns and seen the abuses that are perpetuated and condoned in these circles, I've seen how deference to authority ends up facilitating this abuse of power, covering it up. And I'd seen just the toxic effects of that. And so I knew early on that I did not want to participate in that practice. I did not want to participate in any way in that deference to authorities within the evangelical world. And so I tried to, make that clear in the title, the tone of the book, that yes, I'm speaking to white evangelicals here, but I'm not showing deference to their authorities. So I guess what kind of a book is it? It's a crossover. It's an academic book written for a general audience, written for an audience outside of evangelicalism, but also it's speaking directly to evangelicals. It tries to do a lot. Fortunately, I can say 7 months out, it seems to have landed quite well. It seems to be embraced by those outside the culture, and surprisingly, I think its biggest fans, it's fair to say, are white evangelicals themselves.
Yeah, I'm on Twitter and on Facebook, and I see someone posting something about it almost every day. So it's definitely reaching the audience, and because of that, those who are not entirely familiar with the evangelical world, there are quite a few terms that you use in our book that our listeners, no doubt, would love to hear you expand on a bit more. Can you break down, for example, what do you mean by Christian nationalism? What is the relationship between Christianity and nationalism?
Yeah, so Christian nationalism has really become the term of the day in terms of religion and politics, and so I will point everybody to books that focus explicitly on this, particularly Andrew Whitehead and Sam Perry's Taking America Back for God, a sociological study of Christian nationalism. We found each other actually as we were writing our books through Twitter, through things that we were posting. And I would post, a little, a fragment of this book or a little argument, and these sociologists would jump in with, oh yeah, and here's the supporting data for that claim. And so I think of our works as different disciplinary approaches, but really describing the same thing. And so it's been a kind of fun partnership. And so Christian nationalism for me, and you can get more technical and you can get more sociological, but for me at its heart, and the way I see it operative in evangelical circles at the grassroots, is the belief that America was founded as a distinctively Christian nation, and it must be defended as such. And so to defend Christian America means to defend it against domestic enemies, against internal threats, against liberalism, secular humanism, feminism, against incursions on religious liberty and the like. And it means defend it against external threats. So against communism earlier in the 20th century, against radical Islam, against which will entail a military defense. And so it's a militaristic posture, and all of this rooted in the ideal that America is distinctively Christian, and then that evangelicals in particular, as kind of the most faithful American Christians, have this absolutely critical role to play to defend and preserve American Christianity, because that's at the core of Christian America and defending the American nation. So that's how Christian nationalism functions in the story that I tell.
So is nationalism something intrinsic or essential in evangelical theology, or did it come from some outside source? That is, was it adopted or appropriated by evangelicals at some point in the early decades of the 20th century?
Yeah, so I'm a 20th century Americanist, and so I'm always a little cautious to make any grander claims. And then even when we talk about evangelical theology, what are we actually talking? Is there some ideal form, or is there evangelical theology as it finds expression through time? So I would say that there is not necessarily anything within evangelical theology that you find religious nationalism outside of evangelicalism. Certainly, is evangelicalism more prone to this? Not necessarily, I would say. You can find this continuity, you can find expressions of it. Evangelicals like to go back to, kind of Puritan America, city on a hill, and find, so you could build this timeline to make that case. But you can also find iterations of evangelicalism, I think, that disrupt the status quo, that disrupt this idea of Christian nationalism, depending how broadly you define evangelicalism, depending on where and when you're looking. And so, as soon as you try to make these broad claims as a historian, I want to get back to the specifics and say, okay, well, let's look at 19th century evangelicalism in the American South, and let's look at those dynamics. And even within that, you're going to see change over time here. Let's look at evangelicalism in the early 20th century and the social reform movements, and what is the relationship between faith and nation in those circumstances. Or let's look at the First World War, and let's see how conservative Protestants responded to war, responded to militarism, responded to this notion of Christian America. And you're going to find a lot of diversity. You're going to find some conflict, and you're not going to be able to tell this kind of smooth story. So, as historians, we're all about complexity and change over time. And I think I'd really want to frame that kind of a question, and certainly any answer to it, with a real attention to complexity and change over time.
Great. So you also talk quite a bit about Christian patriarchal authority. What exactly is that?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's really pretty simple that men, as men, have God-given authority, a lot of God-given authority over women, over children, authority in the church, authority in the home, authority in society. Now, exactly, what shape that takes in the home, in church, and society can vary, but there tends to be a lot of agreement, certainly within conservative evangelicalism, that God has structured society, has structured humanity in such a way that to be obedient to God, to live as God created you to live, you need to respect these authorities, these God ordained authorities, and then it's not just patriarchal authority. It's not just the authority of the man in the home, although it is very much that. It's not just the authority of the male pastor. It is that. It's really this embracing hierarchy as just central to understanding God's will for humanity, the way things ought to be. So a very hierarchical order of God-appointed leaders. Now, again, who gets to decide who the proper God-appointed leaders are? There's a lot of debates, even in very recent weeks and months, about what who counts as a God-appointed leader, and that's a key question. But if they agree on a God-appointed leader, absolute authority must be given and submission to that authority, and then so that the authority of national leaders, God-appointed ones, is linked directly to the authority of pastors over people in their churches. Some will also add employers over employees in this hierarchy, and then certainly men over wives and children in the home. And so each of these are seen as kind of interlinking relationships of power, and you want to you don't want to allow like the disruption of authority at any place along this hierarchy, because doing so will threaten the entire order. And so that was actually a surprise to me when I started researching this book, when I got into this, what is this family values evangelicalism, going back to the 60s, going back to the 1970s. I was not prepared for just how hierarchical and frankly authoritarian the teachings actually were on, being a Christian wife, husband, evangelical family values generally.
Yeah, I mean, a related question, I guess, to the question of how is evangelicalism defined and structure and authority. What role does ecclesiology have in evangelical theology? Do evangelicals have, for example, an overarching or unifying doctrine of the church? And Protestants typically have a looser definition compared to the Roman Catholic Church, right?
Much looser, much looser. Yes. So here, across evangelicalism, you're going to find different ecclesiologies. You're going to find some that are much more structured, depending if you're looking at a traditional denomination, a conservative denomination. So conservative Presbyterians are going to have their own model, different from Southern Baptists, right? So there's a lot. It's going to depend on where in the evangelical world you're kind of zeroing in on. But you have this really prominent movement of non-denominational churches, right? This more entrepreneurial evangelicalism that traces back to this revivalist history, and that's really important. And that's where that I think really does define much of American evangelicalism today, or at least is a powerful defining force. And so here you have a turning away from traditional denominational authorities, from traditional theology, even, and you don't have the accountability that can come with certain denominational structures. Instead, what you see is the embrace of first, this entrepreneurial spirit, where any leader can go ahead and start their own church. The success of that church will be a sign of God's blessing. and that they're doing God's work. And so that only enhances their authority. And it tends to kind of fuel a celebrity culture. So that, again, any celebrity evangelist, so somebody like Billy Graham can do, great things, and that is a sign that God's hand is upon him. And these folks tend to be kind of independent operators. And then you've got, the mega churches, independent, non-denominational, some of those, really big, but then you have a lot of just community churches, non-denominational churches springing up all over the place. And so, but they aren't fully independent. Like their authority structures may be, independent, accountable to no one except maybe their own elders, or maybe not even that. The power dynamics can vary. But they are part of this larger network. They are part of this larger kind of community. And they are like bound together through varying alliances, partnerships, networks. And so it's very complicated when you get to evangelicalism and understanding how authority actually operates in these communities.
It's very interesting because I myself am a historian of Protestant religious thought, so I haven't spent much time in looking at the Roman Catholic side. But it seems this history of masculinity and militarism is very much a Protestant story, and I don't know if that has played a role also in the Roman Catholic Church. Do you know anything about that?
I've kind of had my eye on, how this plays out in Catholic circles, and you're right. There are very real differences. Certainly, within the Catholic hierarchy, you've had a really strong voice against militarism, right? More of the just war theory, more of Christian pacifism, and so from the top down, in many cases, you'll see forces that are working against this. That said, I do know that I've heard from many Catholics and Catholic scholars who are seeing some of the same kind of cultural allegiances that I identify in Jesus and John Wayne having taken root in conservative Catholic circles. And this is where I think we have to go back to the 1960s, 1970s, where we see this growing alliance between conservative evangelicals and conservative Catholics. It's a political alliance, but it's also a cultural alliance increasingly. And so gender, sexuality, quote unquote, traditional masculinity, traditional femininity are part of this package. And so I think that that's where we'll see some affinities. Now, that said, Jesus and John Wayne really traces the influence of these ideas through the spread of evangelical popular culture, consumer culture. And that's where the Catholic world has their own, right, their own media, their own culture, less of a subculture, I think, less of a consumer culture. And so I think we really need scholars to study this. What does this look like within Catholicism? You've got the political alliances at the top. You've got some of these cultural affinities from the grassroots. But what exactly do these dynamics look like within Catholic circles? I'm really curious about that.
Okay, so get back into some of the meat of the book. You start the book with the rise of U.S. fundamentalism. Can you give us a brief description, some comments on what that was and is? What is American Christian fundamentalism, and when did it emerge, and who were its leaders?
Oh, okay, yes. So, I look at fundamentalists early in the book. To kind of root the story of 20th century evangelicalism. But quick caveat, you can find, and this is where many evangelicals today will kind of go back to the fundamentals in the 1910s, this rejection of theological modernism, this, again, recovery of old time religion, which was actually quite innovative. All of this is kind of part of their origin story. But I would add that the more progressive evangelicals, social reformers, including many who became modernists, were also like evangelicals in the 19th century and in the early 20th century, right? But they kind of get written out of the story. So I'll just kind of bracket that and acknowledge that. But to pick up with fundamentalists in the early 20th century, that is this kind of reactionary movement to reject theological modernism, to uphold the authority of the scriptures, things like the virgin birth, and also to reject kind of modern feminism in the 1920s. So gender traditionalism was a part of that. And it really came to define the conservative response to early 20th century kind of change. And they ended up, struggling to control Protestant denominations, and for the most part kind of lost out to, if not the modernists, then the more moderates. So what happens then is evangelical or fundamentalists end up, starting their own organizations, starting their own churches, and their own Bible schools. And it seemed for a time, from kind of the perspective of coastal elites, perhaps, that, fundamentalism was dead, but many historians have demonstrated that's absolutely not the case, right? They built their own networks. They built their own institutions. And it was in the 1940s that they decided to come together again in the National Association of Evangelicals, these conservative Protestants, to band together. They knew they had a wealth of resources spread across the country in these independent churches, institutions. And so they knew, hey, if we come together, we can do great things here. Now, they called themselves the National Association of Evangelicals, and there was a splinter group of fundamentalists who had their own organization. And so evangelicals defined themselves against these more radical, reactionary fundamentalists. And so that gave them the self-perception of, we are the kind of the ironic ones, because the fundamentalists were the really militant ones. We are not them. We are not separatists. We are engaging the culture. We are evangelizing. We are, we're working across differences, and they just want to go off in their own camp. And there was truth to that. Like, fundamentalists did not like Billy Graham because he was way too ecumenical, right? And so there were these divisions, and that ends up, and evangelicals themselves are very aware of these. So they define themselves against the more extreme militancy of fundamentalists. Then they carry that self-identity on through the 20th century up to the present day. One of the things that I argue in this book is that the separation was never complete. And that even though fundamentalists, yes, had their own churches, their own organizations, then you have somebody like Jerry Falwell Sr. coming along, fundamentalist, but absolutely shapes American evangelicalism and evangelical political engagement. And within the movement itself, you have, evangelicals and fundamentalists always in a kind of, still in a community. Even if fundamentalists won't acknowledge it, evangelicals kind of aware of what's going on to their right, and still kind of part of the same broader movement, even as they have some pretty stark disagreements. And then over time, you can see some of these more conservative elements and really influencing the mainstream evangelical movement. So I mentioned Jerry Falwell Sr. We could talk about the history of the Southern Baptist Convention as a very clear example where conservatives take control of the SBC, and then the SBC ends up rising to this position of great significance within American evangelicalism more broadly, so that by the 21st century, yes, you can identify those are fundamentalists over there. So the independent fundamental Baptist churches or so, like those are the real fundamentalists. But the influence of fundamentalism throughout conservative evangelicalism is very profound. And to just identify fundamentalists as over there in those kind of fringe groups is really a mistake. And I think that's critical to understanding American evangelicalism today and the power dynamics within the movement between conservatives and moderates in evangelical organizations and institutions, even right now.
Okay, well, to stay on the issue of fundamentalism a little bit longer, a question I have is that can the rise of fundamentalism and its association with nationalism be attributed to an increasing sense of secularization? And here I'm specifically thinking of early 20th century American secular humanism. The Humanist Manifesto, after all, was first published in the 1930s. It was mostly signed by liberal Protestant ministers, but soon other educators joined the movement, including philosopher John Dewey. Do you see any connections between this kind of rising secularism and the emergence of fundamentalism and subsequently nationalism?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question to frame it like that. I think a real difference between fundamentalists and conservative evangelicals in the 20th century and other Protestants has been precisely this question about the secular, the nature of the secular. And when I looked at more progressive strands of Protestantism and of evangelicalism in the early 20th century, to go back to social reformers, look at women's activists, and look at progressive reform in general. Many evangelicals were a part of that movement in the late 19th and early 20th century, and they embrace kind of secular knowledge, secular professions. They understand that God's work can be done through the secular, and by that there is good that is happening outside of more narrowly defined religion. And so the question of what happens then is one that I would love to dig into. This is actually at the heart of my Hillary Clinton project, by the way, the question of the nature of the secular. So this is the early 20th century, and what you see is when progressive Christians end up embracing the secular, does that diminish their influence ultimately, because it kind of gets diluted by into these secular movements, and you lose the religious nature, and then you just have the history of progressivism or the left or whatever? Or is another way of conceptualizing this is that they end up, by bringing their Protestant kind of teleology, their Protestant ethics into the secular, they end up defining the secular in such a way, and certainly the secular left, that it ends up enacting profound influence, but we don't recognize it as religious anymore. And I think that's what we see particularly in the 1960s over again with Harvey Cox and his engagement with the secular, with progressive evangelicals, progressive Methodists in particular, this embrace of the seculars. We don't have to be afraid that we can do the work of Jesus, we can do the work of God, right, in cooperation with secular impulses. And but then what happens? What happens is conservative evangelicals, right, very different story. The secular is something to fear, to fight against, to define yourself against. Is everything that we are not. So you don't want to cooperate with these forces, because there's this idea that like God's truth is the source of all truth. And in the secular world, the other, right, they don't have access to that truth. We do. So why on earth would we want to give them authority? Would we want to give them power? We need to defend ourselves against them. And so that becomes a much more easily identifiable, quote unquote, religious force. It's easy for us to track because they're framing it as religion versus the world, versus the secular. And it becomes a very clear kind of mobilization of a religious movement. And that's the history of the religious right. And that's kind of the story I tell here. But another question is what is the influence of Christianity within the secular, within the secular left. But now you you also asked how this all connects to nationalism, and I'll just kind of bring it back around to, for evangelicals, then their idea of the American nation is that of a Christian America. So this is Christian nationalism. And so nationalism takes place right within this us versus them construct. And so, to be truly American means to be truly Christian as we define Christian in this oppositional way. And so it ends up being, I think, an incredibly important connection in defining conservative evangelical identity.
Great. Now, a more familiar, popular topic here among the Mosse Fellows is the history of stereotypes, or the limits of ideal types of masculinity and femininity. Can you tell us a little bit more how you define those terms in your book? For instance, in the context of U.S. history, what is Christian masculinity, Christian femininity?
Yeah. I don't define those terms quite intentionally. I don't think there is a Christian masculinity or a Christian femininity. I'm a historian, so I'm really interested in how evangelicals are defining these things, right? How Christians are defining what is Christian masculinity in this moment. What is Christian femininity? Of course, they won't say in this moment, right? They say what is, right? There's this idea that there is one thing. There is a God-ordained way to be a man and a God-ordained way to be a woman. As a historian, as a cultural historian, right, I'm not looking for that. I'm not trying to define. I'm not trying to argue and say, hey, they got this part wrong, and then this is how you're a Christian man. I'm just really fascinated with how in different times and places Christians answer that question. First of all, when are they asking that question, and when are they not asking that question? Because the question is not equally urgent throughout all of American history. And so to understand the moments when there is suddenly a crisis of masculinity, it's really important to ask why now. Because it's not a persistent question, and it's usually related to economic changes, economic transitions. It's connected to racial identity and race formation, racial identity formation. It's connected to perceptions of American power, right? In terms of foreign policy, it's connected to all sorts of different things. In the story I tell, it's closely connected to the Vietnam War and the anti-war movement, and to the rise of feminism. And there's all these different things happening. And so, how people end up defining Christian masculinity, how Christians end up defining Christian masculinity, changes dramatically. That's one of the reasons why I start the book by looking back to the 19th century ever so briefly. It was really hard to know where to start this book. I mean, it's always hard for historians to know where you start the story.
Right.
And this is a trade book, so even more so. I knew I couldn't, try my readers' patience by going into too much detail too far back. But I really needed to just make the point that in the 19th century, you can find models of Christian masculinity that are, within Victorian Christianity, that are very different from this kind of John Wayne masculinity, right? To be a Christian man was to exhibit self-restraint, this gentlemanly posture, self-control. And I just needed to put that in there as just a little reminder, because when you're just looking at these issues from this moment, from this vantage point, particularly if you're from within the inside of evangelical culture, it can be hard to say like, oh, right. There are other ways that we could answer this question, because maybe the only answers that you've heard are, the present ones. And that should just make us more skeptical and more curious about the current answers that are provided. So Christian masculinity and Christian femininity change dramatically over time. Femininity, sometimes it's to reject worldly standards of beauty, to reject, this worldliness and fashion and makeup and things like that. Within fundamentalism, there's certainly that strand. And then within the story I tell, there's a huge emphasis on beauty, on femininity, on, as a sign of God-given of womanhood and of obedience. And so there's just so much variety, so much change over time. And I don't want to offer definitions. I'm fascinated with how those definitions change over time, and then why.
early in the book, you also talk about something called muscular Christianity. And that immediately reminded me of Victorian authors such as Thomas Hughes' Tom Brown's School Days, or Broad Churchman Charles Kingsley, who often preached on the spiritual value of sports, especially team sports. And is this the sense that you're using the term muscular Christianity, or does it include something outside physicality? And I'm thinking the obvious examples in my head when I think of this muscular kind of portrayal of masculinity. I think of Putin, and then compare him to someone like Trump. Trump doesn't really exert that kind of physicality in his personality.
Right. Well, he's got the size, he's got that, but yeah, not quite the physique that somebody like Putin thinks he has. So anyway, yes, muscular Christianity, going back to the Victorian era, and that's where I initially had planned to connect to Victorian muscular Christianity, and then show how that was then imported to the United States in the 19th century, and ended up, finding expression, particularly on the American frontier, where it blends with this kind of cowboy masculinity, American individualism, the Wild West. There's a great dissertation that I actually cite in my book by Hunter Hampton that traces this all quite beautifully with all sorts of anecdotes and illustrations. And I just didn't have the space to do that. I thought that would the book really takes off in the 1940s and then goes on. And so I didn't have the luxury of exploring those connections. But I will say the muscular Christianity that I'm kind of referencing is more what the Victorian, British muscular Christianity morphs into by the early 20th century in the United States, after it's blended with this kind of cowboy Western individualistic masculinity, how it's then embodied by somebody like Teddy Roosevelt, right? That sort of muscular masculinity, and what we see happening in the early 20th century, which I referenced just briefly in passing in both conservative and liberal Protestant circles, is this men and religion forward movement, this idea that the old, model of gentlemanly restraint, this Victorian masculinity, Christian masculinity, suddenly seemed effeminate, suddenly seemed not properly masculine, right? What had changed? Well, so much had changed. And so that's the muscular Christianity that I really kind of pick up on. But even then, right, a lot changes between getting us from the 1910s to the late 40s, 50s, 60s. So, when people hear muscular Christianity, or even hear the topic of the book, they, people who know anything about 20th century American religion will say, oh, I know what you're talking about, right? Early 20th century muscular Christianity and stuff like. Well, yes, precursor, but again, change over time. It's complicated. And what happens by the 1940s is, so sport is always a motif, physicality, that's great, but it gets linked up with militarism, linked up with American empire, linked together with the concept of using violence to bring order. Right. That's the Teddy Roosevelt motif, right? You need this physical strength, and you can get it through sports. That's a good start. Go out west, even better. Learn to use guns. Go fight a war. Best, right? And so you can use violence then to bring order to the savages in the quote unquote savages on the, in the Wild West, global frontiers, American empire. And so I want to emphasize that this is very much a white masculinity. And it's a white Christian masculinity. And because it's white men who are tasked with bringing order to disorder and using violence to do so. And it is often, non-white populations that need to be subdued. And that's the Teddy Roosevelt model. And that is absolutely the John Wayne model as well. If you think about his standout movies, it is the white man bringing order through violence, subduing, in most cases, non-white populations, whether in America or abroad.
Yeah, that's a great transition into John Wayne. So I guess a question for someone who's unfamiliar with John Wayne, or unfamiliar with just the history of evangelicalism in general. So was John Wayne a Christian fundamentalist.
No, 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 not at all. Not at all. Although rumors continue to spread that he did convert to evangelicalism. They are false, but I think the fact that the rumors kind of pop up.
A deathbed
Deathbed,
conversion.
yes, yes, or close to it, yes. So no, he was not. And let me just say, I did not set out to write a book about John Wayne, and this really isn't a book about John Wayne, but he does pop up enough in it. But no, this is really. John Wayne appears in the story. He's important primarily as symbol. Again, when I was reading this literature on evangelical masculinity, that it was really striking how it wasn't biblical exegesis that would get them to this conception of militant and militaristic God-given masculinity. It was these cultural heroes, these mythical heroes, and John Wayne was one of many. And that was interesting to me. But then John Wayne does have special significance, because if you go back in American history and you can see that he became this icon of American manhood, icon particularly of conservative American manhood in the 1940s a bit, but really by the 1960s and 70s, that's when he reaches this iconic status as a symbol of what was lost, a symbol of American greatness, of this, quote unquote, traditional American masculinity that was always kind of cloaked in nostalgia. And this idea that we need to get back to that. And it was conservatives who wanted to get back to that, whereas it was liberals and feminists and civil rights activists and so on they were the ones going astray. And John Wayne, through his movies, was a very powerful symbol of this, right? So you have, through his westerns, through Sands of Iwo Jima, he kind of represents American power in the Good War, American greatness. And then in the Green Berets, he kind of takes both of these, the cowboy heroism and the World War II Good War like motif, and then brings that to the battlefields of Vietnam and represents the war that conservatives kind of wanted to be fighting, wanted to, the imagined reality that they wished were actually real. So he becomes this powerful symbol, but he's also not as actor, but as individual, is right at the center of the religious right. He's a conservative activist. He is promoting Barry Goldwater. He's promoting Phyllis Schlafly. He's good friends with Ronald Reagan. And so he's very much like on the ground in Southern California, like an activist for, the kind of rise of the right, even as he is also the symbol. And so that's really the role that he plays in this book. And then, like I said, I was surprised to keep bumping into John Wayne. John Wayne, comes back to, so Eric Metaxas and his, 7 Men, we all know that John Wayne is the icon of American masculinity, like say no more. And now we'll go on and talk about other things. And so, yeah, at a certain point I thought, this is a thread I'm just going to pull through.
Yeah. It's evangelicals have a very interesting relationship with pop culture, and consumer culture plays a large role in your narrative. And several scholars have actually pointed out to what they call the commodification of religion, such as Suzanne Kaufman, Jeremy Karate, Richard King, Vincent Miller, and most recently, Catherine Lofton. They've examined the sort of corporate takeover of religion. Can you tell us a bit more about the significance of commerce in creating this evangelical identity, and how did it take place, and why did it happen?
Yeah. So I would probably tweak that kind of corporate takeover language to give evangelicals more agency in this commodification of religion. And historians of evangelicalism have long, pointed to the irony of the self-identity as traditionalists, as this is the old time religion, when in fact they're being incredibly innovative and they're using modern advertising techniques. So here Tim Glegg's book is just beautiful in presenting this, and they're using modern communications techniques. I mean, going back to the revivalists and so on. And so they're always innovating. And there is something about evangelicalism, this entrepreneurial spirit, right? You go out and you do it yourself. You don't need to work through hierarchies in terms of, church hierarchies and authorities and the established church and stuff. No, I mean, if the spirit is on you, you go out and you preach, and you find ways to get your message to as many people as possible. And so there's always this entrepreneurial spirit. And then we see, over the course of the 20th century, that taking shape through Christian publishing, through Christian radio, and then through television. And when the National Association of Evangelicals forms in 1942, when I went back and looked at some of those opening speeches, it was startling to me that they had a plan. Like, they knew exactly what they were going to do. They said, okay, we need to band together, strengthen numbers, no more of these lone wolves, and we need to do so. And our plan to kind of sweep the nation is to use, we need magazines with subscriptions in the tens of thousands. We need networks we don't just need Bible colleges. We need networks here. We need Christian publishing. We need to just band together. And, essentially they're planning a mass culture, a mass Christian culture. And they do it. They achieve this even in just 15 years from where they start. It is really remarkable. And so this was their plan all along that ends up changing the nature of it's not just that they have this belief system that then they distribute through these, modern, through modern marketing and so on, but the very distribution of it through this mass culture ends up changing the belief system itself in some really interesting ways. So I think the best example of this is this Christian Booksellers Association, and the story of how that unfolds. And here too, I'm drawing on other historians' work. This is the work of Daniel Silliman, and he has a book coming out called Reading Evangelicals this next year, where I'm sure he'll have much more to say. But this is from some academic talks that he had given earlier, and he was gracious enough to let me build on this in my own work because it's brilliant. So it's this idea of, when the Christian Booksellers Association came together, it changed the nature of Christian publishing, not just how religious publishing was distributed, but up until that point, religious publishing had primarily been distributed through denominational networks. So through, church networks and so on. And so Lutherans were producing Lutheran books, and Presbyterian books, and these were theological. And so Lutherans aren't going to want to read the Baptist books because that's not their theology. Well, that doesn't work. These distinctions, these denominational distinctions, doesn't really work if you're trying to do, mass culture or it actually just reach wider markets. Now, evangelicals were always, skeptical about denominations anyway. So that wasn't really, we already had momentum in that direction. But then with the founding of the Christian Booksellers Association, there was a need to downplay these theological denominational distinctions. Because you're going to, you want the widest market possible. And so what that ended up doing is shifting Christian publishing more and more away from traditional theology and towards, quote unquote, Christian living. So how to raise your kids, right? All Christians want to know this. How to be a Christian wife, how to be a Christian man, right? These sorts of things, lifestyle books, or more generic, books on how to manage your wealth or things like that. That's Christian lifestyle. And so it really did change the discipling of American evangelicals because of this mass culture and the distribution systems. And I just thought that was really interesting and kind of makes sense of a lot of how we can understand 20th century American evangelicalism, especially the second half of the century.
Yeah. So you say they were innovative. So they didn't imitate any models? Did they have any models to follow, or is this something they just was incredibly new and other more sort of the secular side of society copied the evangelicals in this way?
No, I mean, innovative in the religious context, and but yes, absolutely embracing what was out there. So embracing modern advertising techniques, yes, and then saying, hey, we can use this to sell religion because why wouldn't we, right? Why wouldn't we do this? And so a willingness, despite and there's a little irony here, right? Because earlier we were talking about this religious versus secular, but then you can take from the secular, not to cooperate with them, but take and then use it for your purposes, for, to spread the gospel. But the gospel isn't just a pure gospel, right? It's a gospel that comes with all this cultural baggage, a gospel, a faith that is being transformed, has been transformed, and much more distinctive than just plain old Christianity. And then you'll have very much like influenced by secular media. And so you have Time Magazine and Newsweek Magazine, while evangelicals will have World Magazine. And, you have Hollywood films, and they like some of them. Again, Mel Gibson is cool in their book, but they don't like a lot of them. So then they'll have their own Christian film industry that they end up getting up and running. Secular music, pop music, not good for the most part. And so they will have their own Christian contemporary music, which becomes this massive industry, right? And so, but then the genres there, even over on the Christian side, are, mimicking what's popular out in the secular world, but then they baptize it and they make it Christian. And so they have their own versions of things. So they're still definitely shaped by secular impulses, but then reject that and instead come up with their own versions, their own variants. And this really is the making of the evangelical subculture, right? This is how you can grow up, or you could grow up if you grew up in the 1990s, 1980s, 1990s, early 2000s. You could be fully immersed in this and actually only have, a tiny foot in the secular world, if at all, because you don't need to. All of your, your books on your shelves are coming from Christian publishing. Your radio is always tuned to the local Christian radio station, and you get World Magazine, and that's your world.
So I think a major turning point in your narrative comes in the later part of the book, at chapter 9 to begin. And you argue that the Promise Keepers, which is an evangelical organization that describes its goal as to, quote, bring about revival through a global movement that calls men back to courageous, bold leadership. You argue that the Promise Keepers promotes a more tender, more softer, or perhaps we might say more realistic model of manhood compared to John Wayne. This is not so much a macho masculinity, but one of accountability and servant leadership, as it were. Then something seemingly unimaginable happened, right? The September 11 attacks in 2001. How did that set evangelical aspirations of masculinity in a new direction?
Yeah, the 1990s for me were just this fascinating decade in the larger story, because at the time, the evangelical men's movement was kind of the first time that, this whole discourse on evangelical masculinity caught the attention of, the wider public. It was hard to miss them, with hundreds of thousands of evangelical men descending on the nation's capital. And so it was, set off alarm bells among feminists and liberals, like, who are these guys? And this is the religious right in disguise. And in fact, the 1990s and the Promise Keepers movement is in some ways a kind of step back from this militant, quote unquote, traditional masculinity, in large part because, the Cold War came to an end. And so much of the kind of militant evangelical masculinity had been framed in the context of Cold War militarism. And so by the early 1990s, like, things had changed. And so it was a time of confusion. Confusion is a word that popped up over and over and over again in evangelical rhetoric. What does it mean to be a man? Who knows? It's so confusing. Our culture is sending us confusing messages. What should our politics be? For so long, the Cold War had really framed politics, and maybe we need to rethink our international engagement. So maybe, focus on the persecution of global Christians. Let's focus on global poverty. And the 1990s, if you kind of go back, it's a time of possibility, I think, within the evangelical men's movement to address this confusion. It's a real grab bag. So on the one hand, you have the persistence of patriarchy, certainly. Ed Lewis Cole and this maximized manhood, even the idea of servant leadership, still leader is a part of it. But you do have kind of a toning down of the harsher edges of patriarchy. This idea that that's kind of a little bit anachronistic now. It's not, we have to get with modern times. Times have changed. And so what is the new Christian masculinity? It can't be like the old retrograde macho Christianity. And so there's just like a lot of options offered. And some all the way to the end of the spectrum towards egalitarianism, like equal gender roles, get rid of patriarchy altogether. So, but for the most part, there's this kind of middle ground where it is a return to either servant leadership to soft patriarchy. So we're still going to have the patriarchy. We're not getting rid of that, but it needs to be softer, kinder, gentler. They also didn't get rid of the kind of warrior as model of Christian manhood, but that warrior needed to be tender. And so the tender warrior motif becomes really popular in evangelical books on masculinity in the 1990s. And I read many of these. And what was striking to me here too was that in many of the bestsellers, the books actually open with the Vietnam War. So with a soldier in Vietnam, with an imaginary scenario on the battlefields of Vietnam. And so clearly this evangelical masculine identity is still haunted by the Vietnam War and the kind of cultural divide around that war. So they still wanted the warrior, but a warrior who could also be tender. They wanted patriarchy, but softness. That starts to change by the second half of the decade. I should also add that Promise Keepers is known for pursuing racial reconciliation, one of the few white evangelical organizations, white Christian organizations to really center racial reconciliation. Now, it proved actually to be unpopular with many members, but that was an effort that the leadership pursued. By the second half of the 1990s, we see a kind of backlash already start to develop against the tender warrior, against the softer patriarchy. There's a lot of emotionalism at these rallies, men hugging, singing, crying, pursuing racial reconciliation. And you start to hear voices saying, all right, this is going too far, right? This is a little too soft. What's masculine about this? And so the pendulum starts to swing back before 9/11, right? So by the late 1990s, you have a growing number of authors calling for, we need to lose the softness here. We need to embrace toughness. This is also, you can set against the kind of culture wars context of the 1990s. You have the Clintons in the White House, desperate times call for desperate measures. And so the pendulum is definitely swinging back. And that's when you have books like John Eldridge's appear. John Eldridge's Wild at Heart was published in 2001. James Dobson, Bringing Up Boys, also 2001. Testosterone-driven masculinity. You got to raise your little boys into tough men, teach them how to fight. And Doug Wilson's Future Men, even more so. And these are all on the shelves of Christian bookstores when terrorists attacked the United States on September 11, 2001. And so the pendulum was already very much swinging back, and this just amplifies it. And so these books, become, I think, these bestsellers because the time is right, because people are embracing this message. And John Eldridge writes, God is warrior God, and man is made in his image. Every man needs a battle to fight. September 11, we have the battle, right? We've got it. It's not just metaphorical. And again, this is when I first started paying attention, and I started to see, yes, when it comes to foreign policy, when it comes to views on war, when it comes to, whether or not the United States should attack Iraq, but all of these things, white evangelicals, they've got their answers, and it's yes, so we're going to fight and we're going to be tough. And And so 9/11 was a catalyzing moment, but the pendulum was already swinging in that direction. But that does just amplify these trends. And that brings us to the 2000s, when we see all sorts of expressions, often shocking expressions, of this kind of crass, militant, misogynistic Christian masculinity in evangelical circles.
Yeah, from 2001, the examples you use in your narrative shifts more and more into darker territory. And I won't spoil it for others, but the chapter titles themselves are rather shocking. Yeah. And you argue that Islam replaced communism as the new enemy of America, sort of plunging evangelicals into this ever more cultural war mentality. What changed when Barack Obama became president?
Well, so yes, you do see this darker turn in the 2000s, but before Barack Obama becomes president, you see a little bit of a falling away. George W. Bush, like early in his presidency, right, he's the crusader, he's the cowboy hero, he's the evangelical in the White House. But the wars don't turn out quite like they had imagined they would. Starting to lose faith in Bush and his policies. He didn't appear nearly as strong at the end of his presidency as he did, post 9/11. And so there are some real concerns within conservative evangelical political organizations too, in terms of mobilization, in terms of donations, and so on. And then Barack Hussein Obama comes along, and he is in some ways just the perfect foil, the perfect candidate to rally against for conservative white evangelicals in so many ways. First. Go ahead.
You say that evangelicals have always thrived on a sense of embattlement. Yes. And in that respect, the Obama White House was a heaven sent.
Yes, exactly. He was the guy they needed to rally the troops. So he was an African American. You have a persistent strain of racism and white supremacy, not the dominant strain in terms of, this kind of explicit racism, explicit white supremacy, but you do, American evangelicalism, is something I trace in the book, is influenced by, Southern evangelicalism coming out of the 1960s, opposition to civil rights, to desegregation is part of the history of this movement, right? Not the whole history, but it is part. And there is this strand that continues. For most evangelicals, it's more subtle than that, but you have that to contend with. You also have Hussein Obama, and so you have this very, very strong Islamophobia that has just been stoked for years within conservative evangelical communities. So you can't trust Obama on that front. You have the birther narrative, and evangelicals play a role in perpetuating that, along with Donald Trump, and so this idea that Barack Obama is not American, right? And if you think about in terms of Christian nationalism too, you also have claims that he's not a Christian, and it's actually kind of one and the same, right? He's not American, he's not Christian, he's not one of us, and of course, none of these claims are legitimate. Obama is an eloquent Christian. He can talk theology, like the best theology professor. He has come to his faith as an adult. He has a strong religious tradition, but a progressive religious tradition, progressive Christianity. And so I think he really infuriated conservative evangelical leaders, and he could get under their skin. Talk about, yes, conservatives have particular ideas on, the application of their faith in the public sphere. But so do other Christians. And, do we, if we follow the Beatitudes, for example, what happens to the Defense Department? A little bit lighthearted, but that was not a joking matter for evangelicals who had embraced Christian nationalism and American militarism. James Dobson especially was just infuriated by Obama as candidate, and then even more so as president. And when he was elected president, we saw a small but significant number of evangelicals defect from the Republican Party, particularly younger evangelicals. And that really disturbs the old guard. And so they are explicit about, we need to fight against this, the disloyalty of the younger generation. So you've got folks like Wayne Grudem, right, who has written more on theology and gender roles, writing this huge tome on evangelical politics, and you cannot stray, and really trying to call the young evangelicals back into the fold. And then, of course, you have the sea change on LGBTQ issues with Obergefell, and you also have this rising concern about religious liberty or religious freedom, which for conservative evangelicals is interpreted inside this Christian nationalist framework. So the freedom of Christians like us to live according to our values, and often to also impose those values on others. And so you have all of this coming to a head like during the Obama presidency, and really fueling this both resentment and fear, this sense of embattlement among evangelicals within the evangelical community. And that really gets us up to 2016, when you have somebody like Donald Trump appear. He's crass, he's crude, he does not exhibit any particular Christian virtues, but he's a strong man. And he is not going to be cowed by political correctness. He's not in any way inhibited. Yes, he's misogynistic. Yes, maybe he's abusive, right? All of these things, but he is the man that God has given us, right? Consistent with this longstanding ideology of God-given masculinity as the protector of faith, family, and nation. And he's the best protector precisely because he's not constrained by traditional Christian virtues, right? So he is coming from the outside, but because of that, he is the one who's best equipped to fight for us, to protect Christianity and to protect our interests.
It's really interesting because I had no idea that Donald Trump used John Wayne in his campaign, but there are photographs in your book where John Wayne or Donald Trump is at a John Wayne museum. Is that right?
Yes, in Winterset, Iowa. Yes.
Okay, so how did Trump use Wayne in his campaign?
Oh, yeah. So there's this great picture in the book of Donald Trump with John Wayne's daughter, right, kissing her in this awkward kiss in front of the wax statue of John Wayne at the John Wayne Museum in Iowa. And so it was a campaign event, and she comes out and she endorses Donald Trump as, carrying on the legacy of her father. And she's not the only one. Michelle Bachmann, more than once, has, compared Donald Trump to John Wayne, and he represents a John Wayne America. Trump's evangelical biographers in The Spiritual Life of Donald J. Trump quote this and hold this up as, yes, he is the representative of John Wayne America, riding tall in the saddle, right? A man who's not afraid to do what needs to be done. This is a regular motif. Phyllis Schlafly, right, talking about this John Wayne America, and she comes out and endorses Donald Trump just before her own death. Published the day after she dies, her book, The Conservative Case for Donald Trump, right? It's just all part of the mix. It's what he's come to symbolize and how they identify him. And even through his presidency, right, up through this last summer, he's defending John Wayne. He's going against critics who are trying to, this is after the book has come out, rename the Orange County Airport. And John Wayne is one of the heroes that should be in the Garden of American Heroes, right? So John Wayne, there's a real affinity there.
Yeah, it's incredible. It's that whole symbolism that you're talking about, the strongman motif and the symbolism and that. So you close your book by saying, quote, appreciating how this ideology developed over time is also essential for those who wish to dismantle it. What was once done might also be undone. What, in your view, needs to be dismantled or undone?
An awful lot, I suppose. I think what's fundamental is the question of power, and here too, like I approach this story largely as a historian, but I'm also a practicing Christian myself. And so again, there's a little theological critique worked in here. It's evident in the subtitle, and it's evident, I think, a little bit in the framing of the book. Again, okay, Bible believing Christians, let's talk here. So I think fundamentally it's a question of the nature of power, and the relationship between Christianity and power. And should Christianity advance its interests, advance its mission in this world by grasping at political power, by asserting its power, by using coercive power, whether it's through military, through politics, through this coercion. And so I think that's an open question, and that's one that the book presents. I think rather starkly. One of my favorite quotes in the book is Rachel Denhollander's quote about, God does not need our protection. God just asks for our obedience. And what that looks like is doing justice. So, I really wanted to hold that up. What else needs to be undone is just the entire conception of this whole value system. It has been embraced for decades by evangelicals, not as a distinctively like cultural value system or even political value system. It really has been blindly embraced as just plain Christianity, as the way to be obedient Christians, because there's not an understanding of history. There's not an understanding that things used to be different than they are now, that there were individuals who made these very specific choices for very particular reasons along the way that brought us to where we are now. There's just such ignorance on that front of their own history as a movement. And also sometimes their own personal history of how they've been complicit in this. And so I think if you can understand that history, that brings people to a place where they can ask, is this actually consistent with what I purport to believe? Is this consistent with my deeply held values? Is this the way that my Christian faith ought to be enacted in the public sphere? Or do I need to take some steps back and rethink that? And this book doesn't give a blueprint for the answers to those questions in terms of what should be done, but I think it brings a lot more clarity to how we got to this point, how evangelicals got to this point today. So I think it's important for evangelicals in that respect. I would say stepping back and thinking in terms of the fractured nation part of the subtitle. I honestly, as I wrote this book, as I finished this book, and as I reflect on the book, I think that actually is a really important point as well. This is not just something for evangelicals to wrestle with, but to understand how this ideology has contributed to the polarization of American politics and cultural polarization, and how it is really a threat to American democracy, to our democratic institutions and norms.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, it reminds me of that old question of Christ and culture,
Yes.
What position one would take in integrating one's Christian faith with the wider culture, surrounding culture. So we are asking all our guests how their disciplinary or methodological approach contributes to our understanding of European and American cultural history. Could you tell us a little bit about how the approach that you took in the book, the sources you used, and the methods more broadly, and how those methods more broadly deepen our understanding of European and American cultural history?
Mm-hmm. So I think the biggest kind of methodological intervention that I made, which isn't, earth-shattering, except in the field of evangelical history, it's significant, was to not define evangelicalism primarily according to its theology. To not define it as primarily a theological and intellectual movement, which is often how scholars of evangelicalism have defined it as, here's the theological rubric. You can use the Bebbington quadrilateral if you want, and that the essence of evangelicalism is this theological system. And many of the historians who are using that are doing so in part because they are evangelicals, and that's kind of this self-presentation. And they are also, evangelical intellectuals, many with degrees in theology, and so it kind of makes sense that they would gravitate towards that. And again, this is how evangelical leaders, evangelical elites, do define themselves. To go to the website of the National Association of Evangelicals. So it seems like you're on really, secure ground to go with, their definitions. But what Jesus and John Wayne does is it doesn't ignore theology, but it looks at the interplay between theology and evangelicalism as a popular movement, again, as a consumer culture, as a populist movement. Looks at the lives of ordinary evangelicals and what teachings really form the faith and values of ordinary evangelicals. And it's not the theological tomes. There can be a little trickle down, but it's the Christian radio that they have on for hours every day. So let's look at that really carefully. What are the teachings on gender and sexuality and politics and ultimately theology that are being dispersed through this popular medium? And that's just radio, then let's talk publishing and so on. And so it kind of recenters our understanding of religious formation at the grassroots level. And I think this is important too in terms of understanding some contemporary conversations around the nature of evangelical leadership. Because what we're seeing is a number of traditional evangelical leaders, so in institutions, so something like, Wheaton College, Christianity Today, Russell Moore, as, these evangelical leaders come to discover that they don't have as many followers as they thought they might. This is absolutely the case in terms of individual churches. So pastors trying to lead, and they find out that the members of their church don't want their leadership, and they say, you get in line, or we're throwing you out on the curb. And so this has been like startling, I think, to many evangelical leaders to realize that their leadership is much more limited than they ever imagined it was, because this is largely a populist movement, and it is a movement that is so not exclusively populist, because you still have a kind of top-down working through other avenues, this popular culture, so who is deciding what books get published? Who's deciding what programming is on Salem radio, right? Who is making these decisions? But that's where we need to be looking. And then members of your church might well be, deeply formed for dozens of hours in any given week by these sources. And then you try to preach a 30-minute sermon and wonder why you're not able to lead your flock, right? And I think this is something that many evangelical pastors are confronting right now. Many of these evangelical organizations are running up against the limits of their own influence. And so we need to understand the evangelical movement and the nature of authority and leadership more in terms of this popular culture and less in terms of, the intellectual and theological tradition.
Great. So another underlying question throughout the book, I think, is one of sort of a social anthropology. What is a woman? What is a man? What are their differences? What are their similarities? And what are their obligations to the state? And George Mosse himself often wondered about this tension that exists between acceptance and tolerance of certain outsiders and social stability and cohesion. How can we maintain that balance? And he never really gives a definitive answer. It's a hard question to answer. But thinking back over the course of your research, what are some key lessons, some key takeaways for us today?
So the key takeaways that first come to mind are not very edifying ones or encouraging ones. It's that drawing these boundaries between us and them, identifying the other, whatever shape that might take, the immigrant, the non-white person, the non-Christian, the, unorthodox, fill in the blank, the Muslim, that actually is a very powerful way to build a movement. It's a very powerful way to build community, and to compel loyalty. It's a very powerful way to raise money. It's a great way to mobilize politically. And so when I look at this history, it's honestly rather discouraging, because you can see that this othering, this, kind of constructing this oppositional identity is very effective. And so when you try to think, okay, how do you counter that? It's really hard to not kind of copy those methods, but that's not going to get us where we ultimately want to go. And so in the short term, it's alarmingly effective. So what I would hope to do is just point people to the slightly longer term. Right? What happens next? And for evangelicals, or for Christians, or for people from various faith traditions, I think to introduce the idea of the common good, right? That has not gotten a lot of airtime within conservative evangelical circles for quite some time. But what is the common good? To rethink, the values of a democracy, and to think about where, what if we continue to pursue this polarization and this us versus them mentality, what are the next steps? What are the next steps for the country? I think they're quite alarming. Even the current place we're in is quite alarming. But ultimately, what are the next steps for your faith communities as well? And so yes, the lessons are not encouraging in the short term, but I think we need to have the imagination to look a little longer term. And I mean, we could look to history there as well. And what was interesting is when I first wrote my first essay on evangelical masculinity and militarism, and timed it to the inauguration of Donald Trump in 2017. Within a couple of days, I got an email from Michael Lackey, a scholar of German history and German Christianity. And my outside field happens to be in 20th century Germany, and in Holocaust studies in particular. I worked with Doris Bergen when I was a graduate student. She's the author of Twisted Cross and other works. And so this was, and I also lived in Germany for a time. So this was very much kind of in mind as a backdrop. And when the scholar reached out to me, he had read some of the quotes in my essay on this militant Christian masculinity, and he shared quotes from the German Christian movement, and they were indistinguishable. And I had known this, but to see it that starkly, and that was something I kind of grappled with as I wrote this book. Do I go there? Do I make that comparison? I ended up not more the structure of the book, where I thought I needed to end this book. That has always been on my mind, and has absolutely been on my mind since the publication of this book. And when we've seen, the Capitol insurrection, the events of January 6th, and we've seen some of these, more extreme actions, to think about, and it's always unpopular to go there. You have to go there very carefully, but to think about what lessons could be learned from other historical eras, including 1930s and 1940s Germany and the German Christian movement.
Thank you for that. So with Trump no longer in office, obviously, what do you think is next for the evangelical voter?
Hard to say. So traditionally, if you look at historical patterns, what we have seen over the last few decades is when evangelicals find themselves outside of political power. So when Republicans don't hold the White House, that tends to actually mobilize evangelicals. That tends to strengthen their movement. It's when a Republican was in the White House, so Reagan or Bush or the other Bush, that things kind of fall apart, and they have a hard time raising money, and some of their organizations end up shutting down because it's really hard to kind of gin up that sense of urgency and have people dig deep into their pockets and contribute. That changed with Donald Trump, and that was part of his genius. I think that he was able to hold the office of the president, to give special favors very explicitly to conservative evangelicals, give them positions of power, and still stoke their fears in their sense of urgency. So he was able to do it all. And so I don't know where that leads us next. On the one hand, history demonstrates that we should expect further radicalization when they find themselves outside of power, out of power. On the other hand, what happened under the Trump presidency really was unprecedented. And so I'm not quite sure what happens to a movement when their leader, because he did become their leader, and when leader of his base, his evangelical, not of all evangelicals, but of his conservative evangelical base, when he no longer holds the power that he held for 4 years, when he's just out on his golf course. He's not on Twitter anymore. He's not the leader of the free world anymore. So how does that, if they were drawn to him because he is the strong man, and now he's not looking, he doesn't have a lot to offer right now. Where does that leave this movement? I honestly don't know. I'm continuing to watch this play out. What I do see is the divisions within white evangelical communities are deep. And I don't think that these can just be papered over and that evangelicals move on, in a few months as if nothing happened. That would surprise me. I'm not sure how exactly it will play out, but I think there's going to be a kind of sorting out within evangelical churches and organizations within the broader movement.
Yeah, I guess one would hope that they would look within and reevaluate their allegiances and their connection to the political realm. And I think books like yours helps them see, or helps the start of that process to look within and begin reevaluating things. So final question. What's next for you in terms of research and projects? And I think you mentioned a little earlier a book that you're working on. So what's next for you?
Well, actually, I've continued to set aside the Hillary project. We still need a little bit more dust to settle on that one. But I happen to have another project that I was kind of doing as a hobby. And so that one has moved up, and it's one that I'm really excited about. So the title is Live, Laugh, Love. And it is a cultural history of white Christian womanhood. So essentially, Jesus and John Wayne, but for the girls. And it is covering roughly the same period and looking at ideals of Christian femininity, not just evangelical.
Is there a particular figure as important as John Wayne for evangelical women?
No. It's more... It's themes of beauty and love and domesticity, and it's a different kind of consumer culture connected. And so inspirational fiction and direct sales marketing and mommy blogs and Hallmark movies and things like that. So It's this kind of cultural manifestation, all of which I'm analyzing in terms of neoliberalism, post-feminism, and white supremacy.
Okay. Now, final question. Could you recommend a few articles, chapters, or books on this topic more broadly? And we would put those descriptions in the YouTube box below, so we can the listeners can look it up after the webinar.
Yeah. So other important works on white evangelicalism and in our current religious and political situation. Let's see. I would start with, if you want to understand the earlier history of 20th century evangelicalism and how it's not the old time religion and how it kind of brands itself and rebrands itself, Tim Glugg's Guaranteed Pure is a great place to start. It's a fascinating book. Other histories of evangelicalism through the 20th century, Matt Sutton's American Apocalypse is a really great book. In terms of more recent Christian nationalism, the key book on that topic, sociological study, would be Andrew Whitehead and Sam Perry's Taking America Back for God. There's also a little book that came out last year, Lauren Kirby's Saving History, and it's an ethnographic study of cultural heritage tours in Washington, D.C., which is a really nice job teasing out this seeming tension between a sense of entitlement, Christian America, and the sense of embattlement, and exactly how those actually hold together very closely. Let's see. Others on the kind of the religious right in this moment. So mine is more of a popular history. There are important works by like Catherine Stewart, The Power Worshippers, Ann Nelson, Shadow Network, Sarah Posner, Unholy, more journalistic accounts of some of the kind of behind the scenes political alliances, how money is changing hands, things like that I think are nice companion pieces to this more cultural history of cultural and religious history that I provide. That's a few. I know I'm missing several. There's so many interesting books out right now, like important books from different disciplinary perspectives that that come together really nicely in this moment.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Du Mez. You've given us certainly a lot to think about. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you for your contribution to the study of American cultural history. We certainly look forward to your next book.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.